What's up, guys? Ben here bringing another video today. We're continuing our preview series as Major 1 cycle begins. This is going to be an interesting video. We're going to talk about two teams that pretty much everybody has at the bottom of the league. I still think they're interesting to talk about. I'm, of course, referring to London and Florida. I think the theme of these two teams is that they are both kind of in a rebuilding phase. Let's talk about the changes that they have made. Do I like them? Do I hate them? Where do I think they're going to start in the beginning of the season? I think both teams have somewhere to build from. So let's kind of talk about that level a bit and dive in. We're going to start with London and let's talk about it. All right. So London made a bunch of changes in the offseason, but let's talk about last season to kind of begin this process. Big lineup change coming in from the Cold War season. They had Afro, Nasty, and Zero and Gizmo as their team for most of the season. They rotated Gizmo out during the middle of the season for Harry, but that didn't really work out. And, you know, surprisingly for London, their best result was in the beginning of the season. They had the surprise top 3 at Major 1, and it kind of kept them in the mix to qualify for champs throughout the year, even though they were really just kind of placing top 12, top 8. I thought at the end of the year, they kind of rounded back into form. We'll talk about it in a second, but they weren't really necessarily a factor all year. And so going into the season, they made a lot of changes on that front. All right, so we take a look at London's stats from last year. Shout out my boy Turtle, as always, for these sheets. The biggest thing that will stand out to you is the 12-21 record in control. And I think that was sort of the biggest limiter, especially at the end of the season. Like, they were a very good respawn team. They were pretty solid in S&D outside of their 3-11 record on Berlin, but the control was the real limiter. And let me kind of show you a little bit deeper why that was. If we take a look at their stats by game, you see that they were winning almost 55 to 60% of their game 1 and game 2s. This team got reverse swept a lot at the end of the season. And you see why. They weren't really successful in control. We talk about, stage 3, 2 and 5 in control, and then in stage 4, leading into champs, they were 1 and 6. So they were doing a good job in maps 1 and 2, but really, really struggling in game 3 and then losing all of that momentum and getting reverse swept going into that last couple of maps in every series. So I think for London, you knew that Afro coming in was going to be a free agent. I think getting more composure as a team was really key. But, I think the difficulty that they faced in this offseason was trying to be sort of ahead of the jockey of all the teams signing new free agents. And so London's approach in this offseason to retain some of their players. They brought in 2 interesting names, and let's talk about those. So these are the 5 players that featured for London last season. Obviously, Afro did not end up re-signing with this team as a free agent. He went off to Minnesota. The team ended up moving on from Gizmo as well. Harry was also another player that they moved on to. So you really only had Nasty and Zero retained from last season. And so they have brought in a couple of interesting names around that. Surprising signing from London. I don't think anyone saw Nissim join this team, but because of the situation in LAG, he kind of became an odd man out towards the end of the year and going into the offseason. And so they did the right thing and let him go to a team where he would start instantly, and that is London. And long time, will they, won't they type player with London, and he featured with them a bit in Cold War. Paul X comes over to round out the starting group of the squad. Now, they do have a substitute signed. He is not on the player builder that you see here. That is Scraps. So if you know Matty well, he's been a long-time pro, has been on top teams, didn't necessarily play last year, but might potentially feature in this lineup down the line. And we'll get to why that in a second. But you see that they brought in 3 players, all who had previously experienced in the CDL, to try and kind of finish this roster. It's also an interesting departure from London, right? Because we've seen them mostly build these UK-based teams. And yes, they'll have essentially of the 5 players, 3 that are UK-based. But you got Paul and Nissim coming in that aren't from the UK. So I like the mixed team approach to try and, I think, bring some veteran presence to this team, a little more grit, I think. So what are the strengths of this team? I would think in general, we look at the way that Nissim, Nasty, and Zero play. I think they're a very unselfish team. If they can build the right system out of, following your rules, making the right play, not getting stuck in the same tendencies, this team can be very unpredictable and hard to play against. Nissim's known as being that route man. I think Nasty was a really good gap filler last year, and Trey's always been that guy that fits out well around teammates. I think this is going to set up Paul X, who I find is really the X factor player to an extent, the feature player on this lineup. I mean, he's a dynamic AR player, was a big part of New York's comeback last season to qualify for champs. So I think that's kind of where this team sort of excels from a personnel standpoint. I think where they struggle is sort of the inconsistency of really all 4 players on this roster. You look at their overall stats from last season, and they're not bad, but they're not amazing. And I think this speaks towards sort of the up and down moments these players had. Nasty had some good stages and bad stages. Nissim obviously the same as well, even though he won an event last season. Paul, same thing. I mean, he was up and down. dealing with all of that stuff going on in the New York camp, but consistency wasn't always slaying, especially at the end of the season. I don't think he played particularly well at the New York Major, and Trey's always been that kind of guy. You never really know what Trey you're going to get to on a given day. So I think for this London team, that's going to kind of limit their ceiling, because you look at a lot of the better lineups in the CDL and their players are going to be more consistent day to day. This team might wake up and be able to beat a top team, but also lose to poor teams on any given day. And I think also the slaying on this team is not as good as some other squads in the CDL that have really upgraded. So I would say in terms of slaying power, this is probably your 10th or 11th best lineup on that front. All right, so let me talk about where I think this team will kind of net this season when it's all said and done. So right now in the coaches poll, they have London dead last above LAG by quite a few points. So I think pretty much everyone outside of one team put them last. I kind of agree with this to an extent. I think London's look kind of mixed in scrims early on this year, and keeping in mind, like, they're a team that just moved into a new house in LA, and I think they might be really slow to kind of get that edge that they need in order to really stack up with some of these other more powerful, more skilled teams in the CDL. And I think the big question for London is, you've got Scraps coming over, now finally got his visa, now sorted coming in. Eventually, he's going to feature in this team. So it's a question of, I think, when, not if. So my kind of assessment of London, I think to start, unfortunately, they're a team that I do not see necessarily getting out of groups at Major 1. I think they're going to really struggle to be a team that qualifies for champs this year. But I could see them sort of rallying more near the middle end of the season, really finally coming into form with the version of this team and being a real top 6, top 4, potentially top 4 team at the end of the season. I think the top 4 is maybe a little bit more optimistic and say top 6, but I think top 6 is definitely very doable. I see this as a 2-year project. I like the moves that they made. I think they're probably a piece or two away from being a really good team. But if you can get the right version of Maddie, we know what Paul can do, we know what Asim can do, and then one of either Nasty or Zero featuring this lineup, I think they could be very interesting going into like a second year of this project, making a move and being a real contender. So I'm seeing this London as sort of a rebuild team, but let's see what they can do this year. All right, let's talk about Florida. That's the other team we're covering in this video. Taking a look at their placings and talking a little bit about their Vanguard year. They start off the year with an interesting roster comp. They had Skies, Big Wake, Dave Patty, and Reese Vivid. And a lot of people, including myself, looked at that lineup and were like, 3 ARs, what are they doing here? And, they had some interesting results before Pro-Am. They had a top 4 at Major 2 playing particularly good at that event. But outside of that and online, like, they could beat anyone, they could lose to anyone. And they just kind of got stuck in this sort of top 6, top 8 kind of bucket all year. Like, they weren't a bad team, but they weren't like particularly a good team. They ended up making changes near the end of the season to try and qualify for champs. So they actually let Reese Vivid go to Boston, which I didn't necessarily agree with that change. I think it's kind of screwed them sort of in roster mania this year. They brought in Major Maniac from the Minnesota squad when they made changes, and they brought in Two Real, who candidly did not play particularly well on this roster. So going into the offseason, a lot of questions for Florida. Guys and Awakening free agents, were they going to resign or leave? And I think the money kind of going into the preseason kind of offseason window with this team was, it was going to be a completely different look and probably more of a rebuilding team. So let's talk about it. And by the way, before we do that, I'm sorry, let's take a look at the stats here for Florida. Overall look, I mean, these kind of reflects their record. They weren't bad, but they weren't that good. Really struggled in S&D, but they were about a 500 team in some of the other game modes, in some of the other maps. But again, they were just not, as a team, they were not bad. They were just not good. They were stuck in this mid-pack level. And when they needed to get points at the end of the season to be a top 18 to make it for champs, they were unable to do so. All right, so let's talk about the changes they made. So these were the 6 players that featured last season for this Florida roster. Obviously, they parted ways with Reese Vivid before the season was over. Two Real, they obviously dropped. I mean, you see the 0.74 that he had. I don't think that was more of a spot decision they had to make when they sent Reese gone. And it didn't seem like at the end of the season he was really going to feature for them in this season. They kept Dave Patty. He's now the substitute on the team. Major Maniac has also been retained for this roster for the upcoming season. And unfortunately, Awakening and Skies went to different teams as free agents. So a couple of pickups in the offseason for Florida. They brought Havoc back in his 59th stint with the Florida Mutineers. He was obviously coming over from the Minnesota situation when they rotated out a lot of their talent over there. And they brought in 2 other players who unfortunately are not listed on the squad builder. We have Brack coming in from Challengers. Brack, who obviously featured for Toronto in the beginning of the CDL. He was also a very capable player in and around the last latter years of the CWL, and finally getting his chance again in the CDL after a really good stint in Challengers. And we have Vickle coming over from Toronto Academy. Young, talented, huge, Real Madrid fan. Interesting kind of gap fill sub player to pair with Havoc. I think people are probably pretty surprised that he made it onto his starting lineup for a CDL roster, but an interesting opportunity for Vickle. So let's talk about this squad. What do I think the strengths are of this lineup? I think S&D is going to be their bread and butter game mode. A lot of really talented search players on this team. We know what Major Maniac and Havoc have done historically in this game mode. Like, those guys have been clutch S&D players. They can play any type of system. They can play fast. They can play slow. They can counter trap people. Like, this team, if they're going to win and be successful this season, it's going to be in those gritty game 2s and game 5s. And I actually think potential strength for this could be Brack. I actually really like Brack as a player, and he might come in and be a real surprise star for the CDL this season. You know, he played really good in the CWL years, and I think this was on that really weird Toronto squad in year 1 of the CDL and never really got an opportunity to shine. I know it's a sort of a difficult team situation he's in. He can come in also have an instant impact on a slaying standpoint. Where I think this team is weak is I just think their slaying power and their overall sort of ability and hardpoint I think is limited compared to a lot of other teams in the CDL. Again, we talk about how good Major Maniac is in S&D, but when you look at his respawn numbers over the last couple of years, it's not great. And I think part of that is Mike's not a particularly fast player in respawn. He's just not super impactful in the way that he plays. I think Havoc is also a player who's been really inconsistent in hardpoint. I know he's had to kind of play second fiddle to a lot of more aggressive sub players, but maybe this is a team in sort of a 3 or 4 AR meta might kind of benefit from the game slowing down a bit. But if it kind of sticks to more of a 2-2 meta or even in 3 AR meta at times, if it's pretty fast, I see this team struggling in hardpoint and even in control. So respawn is going to be a real difficulty, I think, for this squad. So let's talk about where this team stands. Right now, the coaches have them voted 10th, and it's pretty tight in these back a couple of spots. LEG on 33, for example. So I think people have them kind of missing out on a champs spot. And I think that's a pretty good spot for them. With this Florida team, you just never really know with this organization. Like, they may show up and just be a really sort of, again, like last year, top 8 squad, top 10 squad that can beat anyone, lose to anyone. You just don't know on a given day how you want to play. And I think the S&D prowess has a lot of coaches thinking that they might be able to grind out some series in 5 maps. And I feel the same way as well. I think my assessment of Florida is that this is a rebuilding year for them. I don't know if this lineup of 4 is going to make it through the whole season. It may be one making a lot of changes and then building something towards either the end of the year or for next season. So coming up in the first event, I think they are a likely candidate to not get out of groups. And I think going and thinking about sort of the end of the season in regards to champs, I think they may fight for a champ spot, but I don't know if they're going to be one of the teams to get it. My problem is that you look at some of the other top 8 teams, a team like Boston, New York, Seattle, Minnesota, Toronto, like these teams all, I think, got better this season to an extent. And so for Florida, I think, you know, there's only 8 spots for champs. I think they're just going to be missing out. But we'll see. They, again, might make a big rotation at some point this year in their lineup. And, you know, no one expected Florida in Modern Warfare to be a factor, and they were near the end of that season. So you just really never know with this organization. For as much as they made weird moves like letting Reese Vivid go to Boston, they did find Big Wake in the first year of the CDL. So they've, at times, made some really interesting midseason decisions to make their team better. So let's see if they do that again this year. But I see it's more of a 2-year project for Florida, and we'll see what they can build in next year's offseason. So yes, that's it on this video. I think for both teams, the theme is rebuilding. I don't know if they're going to be real contenders this year. Likely not. I think they're going to make it a champs. Probably not. But you never really know in the CDL. And maybe these teams come with the fire early, or maybe they figure out late and factor into the overall picture of things. But let me know in the comments what you guys think. You agree with my take. As always, like if you enjoyed this content. Subscribe for more. We're going to have more update videos, preview videos coming for you this week as we get ready towards the launch of this season of CDL on Friday. So stay tuned for more. As always, see you guys on the next video. Thank you all so much.